Hi, welcome to our webinar, Making the Case for Online Voting Standards. My name is Nicole Goodman. I'm an Associate Professor of Political Science at Brock University in St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada, and I am joined today by my colleagues, Dr. Aleksander Essex, an Associate Professor of Software Engineering at Western University in London, and Adam Churchard, a PhD candidate from York University. And we are here today to talk to you about regulation of voting technologies in Canada. We currently have none. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about why we think it's important, the approach that we are taking to achieve some type of voluntary regulation, and then how you can become involved. Because at the end of the day, the more stakeholders' voices who come together and contribute to the process, the better informed and the more perspective the document will encompass. And that's really what we want. One thing I want to point out before we begin is that an earlier version of this presentation was delivered to an Ontario Municipal Association. And so the bulk of the talk is very Ontario-centric, but it is relevant and will be relevant for municipalities across Canada and perhaps, officials in other jurisdictions who are interested in this topic. So I want to begin today by sharing with you a little bit of background and reasons about why this is important. So, this thinking about regulation and voting has been sort of evolving among us for about 5 years. We've written some op-eds on the topic to try at first and incite some political will to take some action in this area. Nothing has happened so far, and so we thought we would do it. We would take the action and be the change to try and see regulation happen and limit the considerable risk exposure that we're open to currently in Canada. We'll get into that a little bit more. A recent version of our thinking on this topic was published in the Election Law Journal, and we're working on another extended version now where our thinking continues to develop. So stay tuned for that. Okay, so 3 reasons why we should be talking about regulation right now. Why right now? One is COVID. Of course, it's affected all of our lives and is affecting elections and referendums and other types of votes around the globe. 2 technical issues that have occurred in Ontario municipal elections, and I'll speak to that a little bit. And then 3rd, public trust in elections. We all know that public trust in political institutions and actors is crucial. It's crucial to maintain democratic legitimacy, and it's closely linked to political participation. So if people have higher rates of trust in political systems, institutions, actors, they're more likely to be engaged civically, they're more likely to be voting and participating. And of course, that's what we all want, right? So so let's begin. So COVID, let's start with COVID. So International IDEA has recently published statistics that estimate about 75 countries around the world have postponed elections or referendums. It's quite a staggering number. Of course, there are many that have not, that have continued, and some of these have gone well. However, there are those that have maybe been less than ideal. And an example of a less than ideal situation recently occurred in Newfoundland and Labrador here in Canada, where election officials had to pivot in the middle of the election to ensure, accessibility to the ballot box. So as we sort of start to think about, the lingering effects of this pandemic, we realize that we might need to be thinking about how we vote and making special accommodations for quite some time. In fact, a recent study released by Harvard University estimated that we may have to continue with intermittent social distancing until 2022. And this study was released before there was talk of new variants. So, there's a whole bunch of factors that could go into this. When we're thinking of elections, and I don't know when the next election near you is going to take place, but here in Ontario, our next municipal elections are scheduled for the fall of 2022. So some considerations election officials will have to think about are delays in distribution and access of vaccines, populations who cannot receive the vaccine and are, additionally vulnerable. So this creates a new special group of electors that election officials will need to accommodate. And then finally, new variants. So we could be getting annual COVID boosters. This could affect voting. The traditional way voting has happened for quite some time. And so this is going to push many election officials to look at remote voting methods, to think about how we're voting, how we could be voting. And many of them will probably think about or look to remote online voting, because it allows us to, it maintains access to the ballot box while allowing electors to maintain social distancing and, ensure public health. And that's going to be a really important consideration. Of course, we need to make sure that whatever voting methods we are making available have some kind of oversight, right? And so in Canada, as we see a number of governments across the country increasingly look to online voting, we want to make sure that there are some minimum level protections in place to limit our risk exposure. Okay, so, one of the reasons to look at implementing voting technologies in a pandemic is to level the playing field, to make voting more equal. So there are certain groups of electors that traditionally face greater barriers to participation than others. And we find that some of these groups of voters can be disproportionately affected in times of crises, such as right now. We also know from looking at, historical times of crises like wars, for example, or previous pandemics, that turnout is historically lower. And so it's going to be really important for officials to ensure that there's a wide range of voting methods so that certain groups of electors are not disproportionately affected or perhaps disenfranchised. Also to ensure that turnout is as robust as it can be. Now, some of the types of groups of voters that can be affected include citizens and military overseas, persons with disabilities, older voters, Indigenous voters, and as noted in the current pandemic times, persons with weakened or compromised immune systems who may not be able to get the vaccine at all at any point in time. So we can look to the US as a recent election that has used technology, and some of you may point to it and say, oh my goodness, well, it was a total debacle. And I mean, obviously that situation continues to unfold. But yeah, what happened in the US was a bit of a disaster. Now, the US used voting machines to tabulate ballots, which is different than remote online voting. But the interesting thing about the US is that they have regulation. In fact, they have a lot of regulation around hardware, very, very prescriptive model of regulation. Mind you, they also have gaps. They don't have regulation around email voting, which is used quite a bit in the US for citizens and military overseas. So there are gaps. But the case of the US goes to show us, one, that we need to be careful about technology, even in pandemic times. And two, that just any regulation isn't necessarily good regulation. So we need to make sure that any gaps are being filled, that we're addressing all types of technology. So this is a broader conversation that has to happen in Canada about the types of voting technologies that are used, not just online voting, but tabulators, for example. We can't rely on the US to regulate our tabulators. That needs to be a conversation that's incorporated here. But also that, any type of regulation is not necessarily good regulation. So each country is going to need kind of their own approach to regulating voting technologies. So what might work in the United States, for better or worse, may not work in Canada. It may not work in Switzerland or Estonia. And of course, even having good regulation in place, a model that does work for our country with our unique contextual considerations, doesn't mean that we have a safety net. Obviously, we hope that it will limit our risk exposure, but of course, nothing is guaranteed. So this brings me to the second topic or second issue, which is technical issues. So some of you may know, and some of you may not know, that there have been some technical issues in previous Ontario municipal elections where online voting has been used. So in 2018, for example, on election day, the evening of election day, a group of municipalities, about 49 municipalities, were affected. All of these 49 municipalities were clients of the same vendor. And that vendor, the collocation provider that was providing bandwidth, placed an unauthorized limitation on bandwidth. So it was supposed to be unlimited, and they restricted it to 1/10 of the bandwidth. And this unauthorized limit on voting traffic, caused websites to slow. And in some cases, voting websites didn't work and people were not able to vote. And so some electors were disenfranchised. Now, some of you might say, well, why didn't they just vote by paper? In some cases, that was possible. But in other cases, municipalities had eliminated paper voting and they were running a fully online or fully digital election, meaning they had online and telephone. And so another option, in the 11th hour of election day wasn't possible. And so these municipalities had to declare a state of emergency and they extended voting a full day. And you can imagine the types of questions that were raised as a result of this around electoral legitimacy and also, whether this could have been prevented had a regulatory framework been in place. So, we ask, had technical standards existed, for example, would the bandwidth issue have occurred? And it's important to take note that we don't have any regulation in Canada currently. So there is zero regulation around voting technologies, which opens us up considerably to a significant amount of risk. I mean, many other countries around the world that have even a little bit of use of technology, or some that have no use of technology, have some type of regulation. So, ideally, governments are proactive rather than reactive when it comes to regulating. It doesn't always happen, but we definitely need to see something here. Now, this is not unlike other policy areas that have called for regulation in recent years, where governments have been slow to adapt. So, for example, there's been increasing calls for Canadian authorities to regulate social media firms like Facebook and Google and take action on data governance and high-tech development projects. These discussions about regulating new technologies affecting governance and government operations are evolving. They seem to differ by policy area, but at the end of the day, if we know better, we should do better, and we do know better now. So let's talk about how we can do better. So finally, in addition to the technical glitches, we want to think about public trust in elections and what potential effect could these technical glitches have on public trust in elections. You think about what happened in Ontario in 2018, and that was a smaller technical glitch. It wasn't associated with the online voting technology per se. It had to do with a third-party service provider and actually a human error just entering in the incorrect amount of bandwidth. But what if it had been much more significant? What if it had been a hack or something? How could it potentially have affected public attitudes? So we can look at some descriptive data to just get a sense of how public attitudes may be affected by this. At the time of the 2018 election, we were doing a study with 31 municipalities in Ontario called the Internet Voting Study. And basically, these municipalities participated in an exit survey of online voters. So after voters cast their ballot, they were prompted with the option to take a survey about their voting experience and let us know if they were satisfied, if they would use it again, all those types of things. And so what we did is we separated voters that were in 7 affected communities into 2 groups. So group 1 voters are voters who began the survey before 5:30 p.m. on election day. And this is around the time we estimate that, trouble with the site started to occur. Dr. Essex was monitoring the situation closely, and he took screen captures of HTTP traffic. And so we estimate around 5:30 p.m. So we split group 1 before 5:30 p.m. There's about 3,500 of them. And then group 2 were voters in those 7 communities who voted and began their survey after 5:30 p.m. on election day. So these are people who would have been cognizant of the election issue because either they would encounter the glitch or they'd be voting the next day after the state of emergency was declared. And so if we look at just some, basic descriptive attitudes, let's look at satisfaction. So how satisfied were you with the voting process? We can see that group 2, those voting after the glitch, were 21% less satisfied. So, I mean, while it's noticeable, it's also modest. And then asking, those same groups of voters, would you be likely to recommend online voting to others? We see an 11% dip. So what can we take away from this? Well, I mean, it's just descriptive, but obviously voters casting an online ballot after the glitch were more likely to be less satisfied, to be less likely to recommend online voting to others. We also know that they are more likely to have less positive attitudes toward electronic voting generally, report a reduced likelihood to vote online in a future election, and they were more likely to report concerns. Strangely, though, not around the security of the system, but rather around the integrity of the system as a whole. So many of the voters knew that this was a third-party issue. They were cognizant of that, and they wanted to see better integrity of the system as a whole. So a modest difference, but something to be taken into account, because if the issue was more serious, what could that potentially do to public trust in elections? It could hamper potential opportunities to use voting technology at all, and it could affect democratic engagement by reducing trust. So, I mean, this is a really important aspect that we need to consider. You know, COVID, technical issues, and then how technical issues could potentially affect public attitudes and trust and engagement, all really, really important to consider. And so these are some of the reasons why we need regulation, and we need it now. So that brings us to our research question, which is, how do we protect electoral integrity in the age of, move myself over here, cyber elections? So specifically, what protections can we put in place when introducing electronic voting, and how would it work in Canada? And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So we're going to make the argument that regulation is required. We need regulation to safeguard the use of electronic voting, specifically online voting in Canada. And, you know, we've thought a lot about this. Obviously, we think we need regulation at all levels of government in Canada, so at the local level, subnational, and national level. But we think the best way to go about this is by building out a framework, a regulatory framework for municipalities as a case study, and then working our way up from there. We think that this regulation model should be structured around actionable principles and guidelines as sort of a base. We think it should apply to a variety of election technologies, as I mentioned, so not just online voting, but tabulators. We don't want to see gaps like in the US model, and this should include software and hardware. And so how we are going about doing this is with the CIO Strategy Council. The CIO Strategy Council is a body that's accredited by the National Standards Council to write standards. And I mean, you know, myself and Alex were writing about this in op-eds, hoping to incite some political will, and we didn't see anything happen. And we thought, so how can a couple of professors go about achieving regulation when we don't have the authority to give these kind of legislative mandates to election management bodies? And the CIO standards is one way to do it. So we'll chat a little bit more about that throughout the webinar, but basically the CIO Strategy Council is going to bring a range of stakeholders together from across the country. We're going to come together and we are going to draft a municipal election standard. And once put in place, the standard would be voluntary. It wouldn't be mandatory. That's a whole other conversation. So, I mean, you know, is this the ideal solution? No, an ideal solution would be some kind of mandatory technical regulation, but we don't have the authority to do that. So this is the next best thing. And this is probably, you know, a path that eventually will lead to some type of mandatory regulation where election authorities can say, look at what's already been developed, and they can take this and make use of this resource. And I mean, election authorities are well aware of this issue. For example, the CEO of Elections Ontario in 2010 recommended standards, but we haven't seen anything happen since. So this is it. This is it, folks. This is how we're going to proceed. So let's talk a little bit about the approach. So, I mean, this research has been ongoing for some time. We have informed our thinking by doing interviews. There's been about a total of 45 semi-structured interviews with identified experts. This has included civil servants, academics, engineers, vendors, lawyers. And we sort of use this material to, you know, provide perspective about how we could approach a regulatory framework. We also reviewed existing regulatory frameworks from countries around the world. In some cases, these were for specific countries like Switzerland, for example, in the United States. In other cases, we looked at frameworks by international bodies that applied to a range of countries, such as the Council of Europe's recommendations for their 47 member states. So that's just some of the examples of the work that we've done. We've also conducted an analysis of vulnerabilities and some survey data, and we'd like to build upon this to also include some focus groups. So specifically in today's presentation, we are talking about a more recent iteration of the project that looks at 18 interviews with stakeholders from across Ontario. There were 23 individuals that Adam interviewed in 18 interviews, and he's going to be speaking about those results specifically, but this is the general approach we've been taking to formulating our thinking on regulation and the project as a whole. Okay. So why Canada, why Ontario? So this is an important conversation. I'll just go quickly through this. What makes Canada unique? So obviously Canada is unique because we have no regulation, and every other jurisdiction in the world that uses voting technologies has some type of regulation. But to our knowledge, Canada is the only one that does not. So one huge gap there, lots of risk exposure. The types of voting technologies used. So Canada is unique in that there are other countries in the world, like in India and the United States, where they may have an election where electronic machines are used for the full election, but these are used at supervised location, supervised polling places. So Canada is the only country in the world of which we're aware where paper voting is completely eliminated, and then elections take place remotely online, fully online. So that's interesting. We also have telephone voting here in Canada, voting by a telephone like this, which is not used in other countries. Other countries have trialed types of telephone voting, like the UK trialed SMS, text message voting, but currently it is just Canada that uses telephone voting. And we actually have multi-channel voting here in Canada, where you can start casting a ballot on your phone, and then when you pull in your driveway, you can finish casting your ballot by computer. So types of voting technology used. Only country where telephone voting is used as an option, and the only country where we have this widespread elimination of paper voting and then remote elections. So that's interesting. We have a unique governance structure here in Canada. We have a multi-level governance structure that may be different from other countries. And while there are other countries that have a multi-level governance structure, like Switzerland, for example, we see in other countries that have a lot of regulation that the federal government often dips their hands into the pot and gets involved. So Switzerland is an example of that, where the federal government has kind of, been a huge contributor to the development of regulation, as well as in other countries. And we don't see that, or we haven't seen that yet in Canada. And that might perhaps explain why we aren't as advanced in terms of governance. At the municipal level, there's also a huge variation in characteristics and resources. And so this is really important. You might have a large municipality with 300,000 electors and an election budget of $500,000 that has an IT team and a lot of technical knowledge and has done a lot of research and has a lot of resources to be able to vet vendors. And then you encounter a small municipality where the clerk is also the CIO and also the technical person. And, they have a budget of 25,000 and a much smaller electorate. And so it's not possible for these municipalities across the board to be vetting vendors in the same capacity. So, why Canada, why municipalities, and why Ontario is a great example of this variation is because we need to level the playing field in terms of technical capacity and knowledge and resources. And the hope is that by implementing these voluntary regulations, that this will help to level the playing field in terms of vetting vendors for municipalities, not only in Ontario, but across Canada. So right now, online voting is used at the municipal level in Ontario and in Nova Scotia, but there has been interest among municipalities in other provinces such as BC and Alberta, Quebec even. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Hopefully this will provide some baseline security. Outdated legislation. Finally, that's a really important point. The legislation in Ontario is extremely outdated. It doesn't even cover unsupervised voting at all. And it doesn't cover any alternative or electronic voting methods. So clerks are really left up to their own devices to kind of figure things out on their own. This has created issues such as candidates setting up makeshift polls, and inviting voters to come to their offices and vote for them, or going door to door with iPads. So eventually this framework needs to be updated. We've seen a lot of other updates in Ontario with ranked choice voting being introduced, being taken away, boundaries being expanded, regional chairs being taken away, but we haven't seen anything yet around voting technologies. So hopefully this is to come. So finally, I just want to provide you a little bit of background information about this specific project. I want to be fully transparent and accountable. And I'm just going to move my screen here so that you can see all of the logos. So this specific project to embark on standards was funded by a MyTax grant. The project was entitled Building Standards for Online Voting, Safeguarding the Industry. And basically, we knew we needed to get a standards proposal into the CIO Strategy Council, and we engaged Adam to do it. He's done a fantastic job. And so as part of a MyTax project, you need non-government partners to contribute financially, and then MyTax matches those funds. So we approached all of the online voting vendors that were currently practicing in Ontario, or looking to practice in Ontario at the time that we knew of. And we also approached some non-governmental associations. However, given COVID and budgetary constraints, although a lot of actors wanted to participate, only a couple were able to. So we just would like to mention that Simply Voting and New Vote did financially contribute to this process. And of course, we'd like to thank them for, their commitment to standards and recognizing that standards are needed in the industry, and making this contribution. That said, want to be really clear that because these vendors have sponsored this proposal, we maintained academic impartiality, and while we had regular touch points with them, they don't get any special access to influence standards at all. This is all done as a separate process. So the goal of this project was simply to write the standards proposal, and we're also doing a scholarly paper and then like a little shorter report. But at the end of the day, the motivation for them, sponsoring this and participating in it was simply because they want to see municipalities have greater protection. Oops, just going to move this. And there's the MyTax logo right down there. Okay, great. So, that's a little bit of background about the project. We are going to continue to expand the project and develop our thinking on this, and hope to have a paper out soon where we kind of depict a picture of where things could go from this point. So after we have this, where do things go from here? And again, while this may not be the ideal scenario, it is a crucial start. And we hope that you will engage in the process and raise your voices. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Aleksander Essex, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the history and how you can do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. So what I'd like to do, I guess right now is just give a little bit of background about how this conversation has evolved. As Nicole mentioned, we've been at it for a number of years now. I would say the first time we started talking about this seriously was in late 2016, when the federal government had it was a process on electoral modernization, and online voting was sort of a smaller component of it. But that, I think, was the first time that we really sort of identified that that we needed to do something. It wasn't happening by itself, and so we needed to step in. Next slide, please. So we wrote an op-ed specifically talking about online voting research and the funding for it. It was a difficult time. I think that there wasn't the same kind of understanding as there is today that standards or any kind of, really anything, guidance, any kind of documentation about this technology was as urgently needed as it is. And also the conversation about the threats was a lot more nebulous back then. I know that, when we spoke to a lot of clerks, when they were conceptualizing the cyber risk of online voting, they were thinking about it in terms of, maybe some state level adversary that might want to disrupt an election. And they would frequently say, well, what is this large country on the other side of the world honestly going to do to small town Ontario? Now, setting aside, whatever you think about that threat modeling and the rigorousness or non-rigorousness of it, the important thing to understand is that the threat landscape is much larger than simply, advanced persistent threats from state level actors. So, what we have seen over the years since that time is sort of more concrete threats and events manifesting, ranging from fraud to, even just as we saw in the United States, spurious and bad faith efforts to undermine the credibility of an election for a political reason. So, whereas in 2016, maybe people were thinking about threats from without, I would suggest that after November 2020, and specifically after January 2021, we need to start thinking more about a range of threats, including threats from within. So one of the things that we've identified in our research is the existence of gaps between what the technology does in point of fact and what is required by the legal principles. So I think, when we're trying to chart a course forward, the first thing we got to do is, I think, just simply identify what is it about the legislation that is not being addressed by the technology today. So that's kind of where we've begun, and I think that we've found some interesting points of discussion. Next slide, please. So as Nicole mentioned, getting standards in Canada for voting is complex. It's complex in maybe perhaps a similar way to the United States, where the federal government really doesn't have any role in legislating how elections are done at the provincial or municipal level. But unlike the United States, we don't have provinces and cities administering the federal jurisdiction. So what we've seen to date is a lot of election management bodies, so Elections Canada, Elections Ontario, and the other provincial and territorial elections agencies, and then their municipal counterparts kind of doing their own thing. And fair enough, they have a right to do that, but what we're seeing specifically with the municipalities is a very broad divergence of capabilities and expert, access to resources. So what we really wanted to do is try to concentrate some of the knowledge, similar to how the United States concentrates knowledge on this topic through the Election Assistance Commission and through the VBSG. Now, we can't form an EAC-like body in Canada, at least not yet. There's not the political will at this time to do that. I'm hoping that by the time I retire, we will have an EAC-like body federally that will be the clearinghouse for all of this knowledge. But in the meantime, we've been working at this for 4 years. We have to take a step forward, and the way that we've determined is the way that we can actually action this is through standards, through industry councils. So the CIO Strategy Council is who we're working with, and they've been great. And I would point out that they were very enthusiastic in sort of acknowledging that this was necessary and needed. So we were pleased that we were finally able to convince somebody to take up this cause, because I realized that the electoral management bodies kind of are under maybe perhaps more constraints, and sort of politically, you know, there's aspects to this, but that's not going to stop us from moving ahead. These cities need guidance. They need it desperately. They need to know what kind of questions to ask the vendors. Because what we've seen so far, especially with smaller cities, is that they just ask the vendors about the technology. The vendors tell them, you know, tell them something, and then that's it. There's no you know, subject matter expertise. There's no concentration of this knowledge across the board that's consistent. So that's why we, you know, want to, you know, put this into some sort of kind of common document that everyone can have access to, everyone can make decisions based on. Next slide, please. Okay, so what you know, what are the benefits of standards? Well, I think that the benefits are probably pretty manifestly obvious, but let's just go through them a little bit. I would say that, you know, if I was a clerk, one of the things that I would be worried about is adopting technology that had some demonstrable sort of, you know, daylight between what the legal principles require me to offer as the, you know, administrator of the election versus what they're actually doing, and that, you know, in the worst case that there might be some kind of event, some kind of, you know, the election goes down on election night, that kind of thing, and that would expose me to cyber risk and ultimately to potentially legal risk. So we see standards as an opportunity to, you know, provide some protection to municipalities by saying, like, look, this is what we all agree is the best thing that we can do. This is what the system needs to offer in terms of protection, in terms of accountability, and so forth. Now, obviously, it gives the stakeholders protection, so voters and candidates. When I was studying the 2018 election, I had a lot of candidates who lost in the election just call me up on the phone. I mean, I just had people from all around Ontario just calling me up and saying, hey, I lost the election. I didn't expect that to happen. I don't know if something went wrong. I kind of wonder if something went wrong. I want to get more information. I want to understand what happened. Can you tell me more about the system? And we would often have to say to them that, you know, we don't know what the vendors were doing because they wouldn't tell us. We couldn't even find out from the vendors which cities they were working with. They wouldn't tell us. So we had to go and find that all out for ourselves. And there's only so much that we can view in the public. There's a lot of stuff that goes on behind closed doors, and we want to bring that out into the public, at least what the requirements are. So things like, you know, privacy impact assessments, penetration testing reports, risk assessments, and risk and threat modeling, and all this kind of stuff. All of these documents are not available to us. So we don't know what cities did and didn't do, and we don't know what the vendors are doing in many cases. And so this is not very reassuring to candidates who lose unexpectedly. I had a candidate, this was a counselor, former counselor, make the point that, you know, imagine that you've door knocked on 1,000 doors, right? You know, canvassing for office is quite a rigorous thing to do, and you really pour your heart and soul into it. So if you lose unexpectedly, and it seems like maybe the system didn't work somehow, you don't know, and you want to get this information, and you call the vendor and they won't talk to you, and then you call the clerk and they say, well, call the vendor, and you're sort of in this like infinite loop. You never get the closure that you need. This is not like a paper ballot election where your scrutineers can sit there and watch the ballots being counted up. In, you know, sort of in cyber terms, they're being counted up behind closed doors. You know, like, this is not acceptable. I don't think that I should have to make that case. I think it should be obvious that elections can't be counted up behind closed doors. And anyone that wants to disagree with me, they're welcome to, send me an email or hit me up on Twitter about that. But I think that whether or not you agree with that, the legislation, the democratic principles of elections command there to be some transparency in the process. So if we're going to change away from paper ballots, we need to offer something that's comparable somehow to the transparency of a paper ballot process. So when we talk to vendors and when we talk to clerks, obviously they are seeing elections through their lens. But I would like to try to remind everyone that the reason that Nicole and Adam and I are involved in this is, we're not making money off of this. We're not, we're not running for office. Our interest is that public elections will continue in this country into the foreseeable future and will survive this sort of digital transition that we're going through in our nation's history. So, next slide, please. So the principles of elections, at least as they appear in the Ontario Municipal Elections Act, are sort of given in this slide. Funny enough, they're not actually in the legislation themselves, although they are in the case law. So they're sort of widely understood to be applicable to the Municipal Elections Act. And these are just sort of like, I would consider every one of these to be no-brainers. I mean, ballot secrecy, you don't really have to think through a lot of these very hard to recognize that there's certain things that you need in public democratic elections. The idea is we are electing our leaders. These leaders are making laws. These laws affect our lives, especially in municipalities. I would say that in some sense, municipal politics has a more direct day-to-day influence on your life. This is what you can do in your own backyard kind of laws. This is what your neighbor can do in their backyard and how it affects you kind of laws. These are what building gets built across the street from you kind of laws. So these kind of elections, they often get overlooked because all of the glamours, at higher tiers of government. But we need to have these elections be done in the same level of rigor that a federal election would be done in, ballot secrecy, fairness, the one person, one vote, all of these kinds of things. These are ultimately non-negotiables. And so when we look at technology, we have to look at them and how and whether they are meeting these principles. Next slide, please. So, to that end, back during the 2018 election, we did a cybersecurity study, myself and my graduate students, and we actually looked at the technology, at least what we could see publicly. Again, these vendors, in many cases, were not, I would say, not kind of being as open as I would have wanted them to have been. They wouldn't, again, in many cases, they wouldn't tell us who they were working with, which cities they had contracts with. This is not private information. It's not a secret that this vendor works with this city, but they basically, left us to have to go to every council's website. There are 444 municipalities in Ontario. Some of them are upper tier, lower tier, single tier. But the point is that, myself and my grad students, we had to kind of comb through every municipal website of every city to try to figure out what they were doing. There was no sort of single concentration of this. You might expect that the province would collect data on this, and they don't. They just sort of leave the cities to do sort of whatever, and that was problematic because in many cases, we're not seeing the technology doing things, doing enough, and in some cases, even doing anything at all to uphold those principles. And so we need to have that conversation, right? So for example, we found evidence to suggest that if your vote is not directly identifiable to the voting service, it's at least uniquely re-identifiable in the majority of cases. So the majority of Ontario voters, their login credential is sufficient to uniquely re-identify them. we have reason to believe that it's probably more directly identifiable than even that. So, how secret is the ballot if the vendor knows how you voted? The cloud provider knows how you voted. The co-location provider knows how you voted. This data, your identity and your vote is passing through their servers in an unencrypted state. I think that to me, and I think to many people, the intuitive notion of ballot secrecy is that nobody would know how you voted, with rare exceptions. So maybe like your mom knows how you voted because she's assisting you to cast a ballot or something. There are select moments where that's okay, but in general, like ballot secrecy means secrecy, or at least if it doesn't, let's have that conversation. We weren't seeing evidence that the municipalities were even thinking about this. Is it okay that the company knows how you voted? And also, what happens if they want to take that information and then start aggregating it? And I think we can envision scenarios where that data might even get aggregated and sold, because that is exactly what every other business does today. Like, so your telecom, your bank, they take this personalized information about you. They can't share it directly because the vote is secret, but can they aggregate that information and sell it? That's a question that I've not seen an answer to, but I also haven't seen anybody asking that question. These are important questions. How is this technology guaranteeing my vote is secret, or guaranteeing that my vote counts? If I'm a candidate and I lose the election and I don't think that I lost, what recourse am I going to have? How do I know that my vote counted? What evidence do I have? And saying simply, well, we trust the system, that's not evidence. So we're really in this place here where we're seeing kind of a big amount of daylight between what we're supposed to be doing and what we actually see happening for real. So next slide, please. Okay, Adam, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Alex. Yeah, so I am going to be picking up and discussing some of the findings from the interviews that we conducted as part of this My Tax project. As Nicole mentioned, we conducted interviews with 23 different individuals, experts and practitioners in online voting. And we wanted to learn a few things, such mainly what was facilitating success in online voting in Ontario elections, what was presenting challenges, and as well, what did our participants think needed to be included in online voting standards, and what did they see as the biggest challenges to developing standards. So the biggest groups of individuals that we talked to were vendors and municipal officials active in online voting in Ontario, although we talked to experts from all over Canada and the world as well. You can see a brief breakdown in the slides here of our participants. So first of all, we wanted to ask them, what's working in Ontario? Because, ever since its introduction in 2003, online voting has been implemented by an increasing number of municipalities with each election cycle. So, municipal officials and city councils keep going back to this technology. Clearly something is working here. So we wanted to find out, what were the key factors to facilitating success in online voting? We can see on the graph here, the biggest factors identified in our interviews were public engagement and outreach, municipal coordination, and accessibility for voters. So to break this down a little bit more, quite a few of our municipal officials, as well as one chief electoral officer, identified public engagement and outreach as critical to a successful online election. So this included elements such as educational resources in a variety of languages, partnering with community groups and going to events to reach potential voters who might not be as accessible by traditional communications methods, post-election feedback gathering, and constantly tweaking the online voting system so that it best meets the needs of voters, as well as investing in voter assistance centers and telephone support for voters who might have trouble casting a ballot online. So these sorts of things were seen as critical to successfully holding an online election. Second, municipal cooperation was identified as a key factor to success. So this includes municipal officials working collaboratively and pooling resources on things such as security testing, communication strategies. This was especially important for smaller jurisdictions that don't have particularly large budgets or staffing resources available for elections. As well, policy work from sector associations like the AMCTO, like AMO, was seen as an important tool for knowledge production. And finally, learning from other jurisdictions. A number of Ontario municipalities have been running online elections since 2003 or 2006. They have a wealth of experience, and so learning from what other jurisdictions have done has also been key to facilitating success in Ontario. Finally, our interview participants also noted that many of the accessibility gains that are touted as a reason to implement online voting have been realized. Voters are able to cast a ballot without leaving their homes. They're able to cast votes outside of the municipality, especially important for seasonal municipalities where a large number of voters might not be around in October when Ontario municipal elections are held. It's a very quick voting process. And as well, several of our participants noted increased turnout with the introduction of online voting, though with the important caveat that, in any given election, there are so many contextual factors that will influence turnout that it's important to keep cognizant of that. I know Nicole has done some research showing a positive correlation between the implementation of online voting and turnout. But yeah, in any given election, anything like things such as the competitiveness of the election or any major salient political issues also play a key role in turnout. But for all of the successes that are happening with online voting in Ontario, there are challenges being faced. We wouldn't be talking about standards if there weren't any problems. So we asked our participants what they saw as the biggest challenges to holding online elections in Ontario. And unsurprisingly, lack of resources was the most common issue brought up. But issues around public trust, the digital divide, and voter habits were also noted. So in terms of lack of resources, although some officials did note that there were some cost savings to be had through online voting, the initial upfront costs of researching and testing and implementing new technology can be expensive. Especially for municipalities that have no permanent election staff and have a smaller IT department, so they don't have a large, robust IT department to help sort of sort through this complex technology with. As well, public trust was brought up as a key challenge for online elections in a couple of different ways. First is just the inherent challenges of getting people used to an unfamiliar technology. Online voting is very different from the paper ballot at a physical polling place that most people are used to in elections. People can't see, their paper ballot go into the box. And so building up that baseline level of trust to this new and unfamiliar technology, especially when it's first being introduced, does present a challenge. Another way that public trust is becoming a problem, though, as the growing problem of disinformation. So this is, information that is misleading or, completely factually inaccurate, usually spread via social media, often has, very anti-government undertones, as well as racist undertones, and it can sow doubt in public institutions and elections generally. And it's interesting to note that a couple of our interview participants specifically brought up the 2016 US election as a catalyzing event for the spread of this sort of disinformation, noting that it got considerably worse after the 2016 US election. It's also worth noting that these interviews took place in fall of 2020, prior to the 2020 US election and its ensuing aftermath. So this could become an even bigger issue going forward. A couple other further considerations regarding challenges to online voting. One is the digital divide. So as some of our interview participants pointed out, not everyone has a reliable device and internet connection and the technical knowledge to cast a ballot online. And so ensuring that those voters are not left behind in the implementation of online voting is a key challenge. And finally, although online voting does allow for longer voting periods that can be 24 hours, or and you can vote 24 hours a day, voters still are very accustomed to voting on the election day evening. And so finding ways to encourage voters to take advantage of that full voting period instead of all coming right at the end was identified as well as an ongoing challenge. So next, we wanted to find out how our interview participants felt about standards for online voting technology. And while no participants were opposed to standards, there was considerable variation in thinking in what needs to be included and how they should be structured and other critical issues. So everyone wants standards, but the devil's in the details. And over the next few slides, I'm going to go into a bit more detail about our interview participants' thoughts on standards. So for our approach, we think that mandatory technical standards alongside voluntary operational guidelines are the right approach for Ontario, considering that need for those baseline technical requirements, as well as the need for flexibility for Ontario municipalities to implement systems that meet the needs of their municipality. So when we asked our participants about this approach, about half thought that mandatory technical standards and voluntary operational guidelines were the right way to go for Ontario. However, 5 of our participants also thought that at least some operational aspects need to be made mandatory, particularly around when those operational aspects are important for security. And before we get into exactly what our participants thought needed to be in standards, we also wanted to ask them a couple of critical questions around standards and innovation and standards in the marketplace. So first of all, we asked our participants what they thought about the importance of ensuring innovation in the technology development and what the impacts of standards can be on that. And while there was a consensus that standards must be stringent enough to ensure security, it was also recognized that voting technology must continue to advance. It's existing in a technological and security environment that will continue to advance, and so online voting technology must continue to advance with it in order to stay relevant and secure. And a couple of our participants actually brought up the concept of standards as guardrails. So, standards are not there to stop innovation from happening, but to guide it in the best possible direction in the public good. Next, online voting technology in Ontario is supplied by private third-party vendors. And so thinking about what the impact of standards would be on that marketplace is an important consideration. We can see on this graph here that several of our participants brought up the concern that the increased costs of adhering to standards could be a barrier to entry and could end up consolidating the marketplace and reducing choice for Ontario municipalities. However, there was also quite a bit of hope expressed that standardized demands could actually help vendors by giving them greater knowledge in advance of what Ontario municipalities are working for, and also providing some standardization among all the different elections that they are running on election night, because all Ontario elections, municipal elections, happen at the same time. As well, it could add credibility to the vendor's product, and as mentioned in the last slide, could incentivize the right kind of technology development. Next, we asked our participants what they thought needed to be included in technical standards. So we see here that security was the biggest issue that was brought up, but standards around auditing, ballot secrecy, and accessibility were also brought up as key considerations. So system security was seen as the issue of greatest concern in online voting development, and also where the clerks needed the most help, given the immense technical complexity of online voting security. So the considerations included data security, so ensuring voter and voting data is secure both in transit and at rest. The security of devices, so while the election is being administered on municipal and vendor systems, votes are being cast through voters' private devices. So ensuring that no security breaches can happen through those devices was also seen as critical. Finally, issues around denial of service attacks and human security to password standards were also identified as key considerations. Next, auditing was also brought up as a key issue that standards needed to address. So this is either the municipality or a third party going and testing the online voting system to ensure that it meets the municipality's requirements and lives up to these specifications given by the vendor. So this can include, but go beyond as well, security concerns. It was also mentioned that having these sorts of audits and having publicly released audit reports are also a really good tool for building public trust in the online voting system. So creating standards around what to audit, when to audit, who audits is a key consideration for standards to address. And next, the issue of ballot secrecy was also seen as something for standards to address. The secret ballots is a key principle of modern democratic practice, but it is also a very thorny computer security issue. Designing a system where, as a municipality, you can be confident that the vote was cast and counted as intended without actually knowing what that vote is a very tricky security problem. And it also potentially conflicts with the concept of voter verifiability. Some jurisdictions have implemented a voter verifiability system whereby voters, after they cast a ballot, are given a receipt showing that their vote was counted and who it was counted for, which opens up the possibility of them, having a way to prove to third parties who they voted for. So, figuring out how to address that security issue and potential conflicts also is a key issue for standards. Finally, we wanted to find out what our participants thought were key challenges to developing a standard system and how they could be overcome. I have more the former than the latter. So we can see here that issues around stakeholder buy-in, building a system that reflects reality, and challenges around who administers and manages the system were some of the biggest issues that were brought up. So, elections have a lot of stakeholders involved in them, from administrators and municipal staff to voters, to vendors, to candidates and other decision makers. When designing standards, it's important that all of these stakeholders are engaged and they buy into the standard system, or else it will have a very difficult time being implemented and being successful. So a key challenge is making sure that rigorous engagement with all stakeholders occurs so that we build a standard system that reflects their needs. Second, many of our participants brought up the fact that we need to build a system that reflects reality. Ontario has 444 diverse municipalities. Most of them hold elections, and a growing number of them are holding online elections. As well, these are being administered, or the technology is being supplied by private vendors with their own, unique capacities. So building a system that reflects the diverse needs of municipalities and is mindful of financial capacities is necessary for the system to be successful. The big takeaway is that we can't be designing a standard system for an abstract ideal reality. We need to be designing a standard system that can be implemented and be successful in the real world context that we're putting it into. The question around who could administer a standard system was also cited as a key challenge. A lot of our interview participants were of the opinion that it should be a trusted authority that is known to the public in order to build that public trust. A couple of our participants brought up the possibility of Elections Ontario administering such a program. But there were also concerns there because Elections Ontario has never actually run an online election themselves. But then the question becomes, who else could run a system like this for Ontario? Finally, a few other issues included the challenge that this can't be set and forget legislation. It must be actively managed and updated to make sure that it's relevant to the current technological and political context. So, and making sure that it is routinely updated to reflect the most cutting edge technology. As well, these are very technically complex issues, but the fact of the matter is most stakeholders don't have deep technical knowledge. Most election administrators are not also computer scientists, and it would be, absurd to expect them to be. And as well, this is a very technically complex issue, but the complexities also span, politics and social and administrative issues. And so making sure that you are designing a system that brings in, experts from all sorts of disciplines and backgrounds to make sure that none of these complex issues are being missed is another key challenge. So we have a lot of knowledge and experience in online voting in Ontario, more than almost anywhere else in the world. But as we can see from these interviews, support is still needed. And we really do need to build on this existing knowledge and resources to create a standard system that can ensure that online voting is secure, accessible, and rooted in democratic principles. So, to tie everything together, the case of online voting in Ontario and in Canada is, unique and complex. There's no easy one-size-fits-all approach to regulation. National standards would be great because, online voting is happening in Ontario, but it's also happening in Nova Scotia, and municipalities and other provinces that don't currently allow online voting have also expressed an interest. So there's a very good possibility that it will grow elsewhere as well. However, the unique situations across different provinces and municipalities, alongside the jurisdictional divisions of Canada's federal governance structure, make a robust comprehensive standard system at the national level difficult at present. We think a national framework to guide growth and create standardization where possible should be pursued. And we're hopeful that a national standard of Canada developed through the CIO Strategy Council will achieve this. However, more work must still be done at the provincial level to create a more robust and context-driven system of standards. And these standards must include both mandatory standards and operational guidelines. They must cover a range of technologies. So, beyond online voting, which was the focus of this presentation, issues around standards around tabulators and touch screens should also be addressed. These standards need to be developed in close consultation with municipalities and other stakeholders. And they must draw upon clear principles as a basis to ensure that this technology is built for a purpose, and with that purpose in mind always. So let me finish off by encouraging anyone who's interested in joining the CIO Strategy Council standards process. The more voices that come to the table, the better these standards will be. So if you're interested, please contact Matthew McNeil. He is the Director of Standards and Technology at CIO Strategy Council and coordinating this process. So please reach out. The time commitment is not too burdensome. It's only about 3 to 5 hours per month, and there's no minimum for participation. So if you're someone who has an interested stake in online voting, please consider joining this process. And thank you so much for listening today.